Alrighty, interrupted by phone calls, so I'm going to start back looking at question 2, which are the 3 characteristics that whites used to describe enslaved people in New England. And I'm still on page 10, and I'm with the heading, How Did Whites in New England View Slaves? And again, I'm looking at those key words because I know that those key words are in the question, and this is where I need to look for the answer. Over the course of the 17th and early 18th century, a distinct set of assumptions and ideas about African people began to emerge in New England. Many whites believed that blacks possessed weak character traits like laziness, disobedience, and stupidity, and that slavery was God's way of punishing them. Well, of course, if you're forced to work, why wouldn't you say, oh, can you explain that to me one more time because I don't get it? Why would you be there's no way out of slavery. So why would you want to be a part of it? It's passive resistance that we all do. Race and enslavement began to be connected as more Africans arrived in New England, and they don't speak the language. So when you don't speak the language, does that make you look stupid? When you've been ripped away from your home and you don't want to do what these people are asking you to do, does that mean you're stupid for not doing what they want? No, it means you are resisting in the only way, one of the few ways that you can. And you're probably laughing behind these people's back because they're buying what you're trying to sell. Okay, that's a cliche. Race and enslavement began to be connected as more African slaves arrived in New England. While it was accepted that white servants could eventually become part of the broader community, blacks were usually thought of as outsiders who would never be assimilated. Not all whites held these views. Now remember, we're making generalizations. Whites in New England did not universally accept that blacks were by nature slaves or that bad behavior was inherent in black people. Some New Englanders saw slavery as the cause of black people's degraded condition and argued that their status would improve once they enjoyed all the educational and economic opportunities of free people. And one of the uh, best known examples of this that I know of is not a New Englander, but actually a Virginian who was the teacher of Thomas Jefferson and John Jay and John Marshall, who will become the first Supreme Court Chief Justice. He was named George Witt, and he was a Quaker, so he fought for banning of slavery. Thomas Jefferson viewed him as a father figure, and he and Thomas Jefferson would have long conversations about slavery. Ones that they really never came to agreement on. But George Witt was tutoring and teaching black children along with white children, and he said they have just as much intelligence. It is opportunity to education that levels the playing field for everyone, and that we all, given the opportunity, can excel. Last 2 lines. How did enslaved people view slavery? So now we're going into number 3. How are slaves going to resist? And I already talked about it, didn't I, in that earlier section. Enslaved people did not consider themselves to be inherently inferior, nor did they meekly submit to slavery. On the contrary, they resisted slavery in a multitude of ways. While enslaved people did not seek open confrontation, that's going to be a lose-lose, many resorted to subversives under the surface, like a submarine. Subversive strategies such as working slowly, there's that laziness, right? Running away or arson. We saw that in the Stono Rebellion, didn't we? In a few cases, slaves resorted to violence. Occasionally, enslaved people managed to bring their plight, so their suffering, to the attention of colonial governments. Here's an example. A quote from Prime and Prince in a petition to Connecticut for their freedom in 1779. So, Prime, name of a person, and Prince, name of a person. Quote, "We have endeavored rightly to understand what is our right and what is our duty, and can never be convinced that we were made to be slaves." End quote. Where did enslaved people live in New England? And I'm looking at number 4. Enslaved people in New England did not live in the same place. Where did most enslaved people live? By the beginning of the 1700s, approximately 1,000 enslaved Africans and African Americans were working in New England. That number increased dramatically over the next half century. By 1755, there were 13,300 enslaved people living in New England. And there you have this wonderful graph here. So make sure you take a look at that. It breaks down those New England states, well, colonies at this point. Enslaved people were not distributed evenly throughout the New England colonies. They were concentrated in major cities and in some agricultural areas. By the end of the colonial era, there were more enslaved people in Connecticut than any other New England colony. Rhode Island had proportionately more enslaved people than Connecticut, but its overall population was much smaller. So statistically, higher, but that's because there were less people overall living in Rhode Island. Rhode Island's slave population was dispersed throughout the colony. The largest numbers lived in port cities like Newport and Providence. Many also lived in South County, an agricultural region that by the middle of the 18th century had over 1,000 enslaved people. 27% of the town of South Kingstown in 1748 was enslaved, a proportion roughly the same as in the southern colonies at the time. Enslaved people in South County, like their counterparts, like those similar, in Connecticut, were engaged primarily in agricultural work. Robert Hazard, for example, a dairy farmer, owned 24 women, 12 of whom worked to make cheese. Much of that cheese went to the Caribbean on trading ships. Next section on page 11. What kind of work did enslaved people do? I'm going to pause here. I'm looking at my study guide, and number 5 just list 5 jobs enslaved people did in towns, 3 that they did on farms, and we already know one, right? They make cheese. The majority of enslaved people in New England, like slaves in the South, worked in agriculture or as domestic servants. In addition to farming, women engaged with spinning, child care, mending, and cooking. Some slaves became highly skilled workers, serving as clerks, caterers, artisans, like making furniture or other household items, pottery, and merchants, so working in stores. Many enslaved people worked in busy seaports. About 20% of the town of Newport was black in the middle of the 1800s. Enslaved people worked in maritime trades, such as rope making, sail makers, or sailors on whaling ships. Think Crispus Attucks. Enslaved people were carpenters, rum distillers, chimney sweeps, locksmiths, cabinet makers, butchers, and coopers. So they are making the big barrels. That is like the cardboard, the shipping material for items being transported. Enslaved people also figured prominently in the small iron industry of New England. Many enslaved and free blacks worked in the Brown Brothers iron furnace. So, making tools. There were several examples of individual enslaved people who were able to use their entrepreneurial abilities to carve out special roles for themselves. Caesar Linden of Newport kept his master's accounting books and managed a complex network of small business and coastal trading ventures. Right there, proof that and blacks are not unintelligent. Newport Gardner, so named after the town he's living in, Newport Gardner, who taught himself to read and write. Who can do that? In English and French, opened a singing school in Newport. Adam, an enslaved person on a Connecticut farm, managed the property for months while his master was away. One enslaved person in Connecticut, named Primus, took over his late master's medical practice. Skilled slaves had some bargaining power. Their work was in demand, and many owners depended on them. In Connecticut, 1/2, so 50%, of all ministers, 1/2 of all lawyers, and 1/3 of all doctors owned slaves in 1774, 2 years before the Declaration of Independence is written and signed. The work those enslaved people did in the homes or businesses of their owners made it possible for their owners to work outside the home, to travel in their business, to try new endeavors, or expand their businesses. The growth of the enslaved population throughout the 18th century resulted in an increase in productivity among New Englanders and an increase in different kinds of economic activities. Once enslaved people could be used to maintain farms, for instance. Farmers were free to make crafts to sell. Between 1700 and 1750, the merchant and artisanal classes, so the artisan group, sorry, I'm mispronouncing that, grew significantly. Slavery made it possible for many New Englanders to build up a great deal of wealth. And it's just too bad that that indentured servant economic system or a different economic system wasn't created, because it's this historical reliance on slavery is just sickening. Okay, I'm going to end this one here, and we'll start at the bottom of page 12 with the next video. So we answered questions 3, 4, 5, and 6 will be coming up.